In the last video, we talked about the history of stress and the psychological symptoms of stress. In this video, we're going to talk about what stress does to your body and how it can make you sick. So, remember in the last video we talked about Han Soyi, how he was real clumsy with his rats, and no matter what he did to his rats, they always had the same symptoms. What I'd like to suggest in this video is that the stress response, which causes those symptoms, makes sense from an evolutionary viewpoint. Selye, and many others since him, have argued that the stress response has adapted to protect the person or animal from sudden harm. So to keep the person or animal alive in the face of some acute physical stressor, like being chased by a polar bear. The stress response is ideal for helping people deal with these acute physical stressors. However, as it turns out, we aren't very often chased by predators anymore. Instead, we get stressed out by chronic stressors such as worrying about school and dates and money and bad drivers. And running the stress response for those kinds of things doesn't really help us with those chronic stressors. And in fact, it does all kinds of harm to our bodies. Before I go in to all of the systems of the body, I'm going to give you a very general overview of the whole stress response. That way, you can keep this framework in the back of your mind as we go through, go into the details of the stress response. So, first the overview, the big picture, is that under stress, your brain sets off two main categories of chain reactions. The first reaction in response to stress is from your autonomic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that controls many involuntary, automatic, more visceral or functions such as respiration, digestion, arousal, perspiration, salivation, and so forth. There are two parts of our autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Under stress, the sympathetic nervous system is activated and the parasympathetic nervous system is suppressed. The sympathetic nervous system is the one that causes the fight or flight response in your body. It's the system that mobilizes energy so that you can act. The way it does this is by causing a bunch of hormones called catecholamines to be released. One of these catecholamines is epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which helps mobilize energy in your body so that you can act. This is what you generally think of as happening to your body during stress. The parasympathetic nervous system helps out with calm vegetative types of activities such as growth, digestion, and energy storage. Under stress, the parasympathetic system is inhibited, which makes intuitive sense. If you don't need to quickly get away from a predator, you don't really need to worry about growth, digestion, or energy storage, which are the things the parasympathetic system is in charge of. One mnemonic I use to keep the sympathetic and parasympathetic system straight is that the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated during times in which other people are likely to feel sympathy for you. So for example, when you're being chased by a bear, the sympathetic nervous system becomes activated. The second main reaction in response to stress is activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, or the HPA axis. Activation of the HPA axis leads to the general adaptation syndrome that Selye discovered in his work with his rats. So shrunken lymph nodes, enlarged adrenal glands, bleeding ulcers, and so forth. The way the HPA axis does this is by releasing a bunch of hormones called corticosteroids, such as cortisol. These two main responses, the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis, lead to a whole lot of changes all throughout our body. Now remember in the last video I talked about stress appraisal and how you have to decide if a stressor is harmful, threatening, or challenging, and I mentioned that Jim Blaskovich found that these appraisals change what sort of stress response you get. If you appraise the stressor as harmful or threatening, you get both autonomic response and the HPA response. But if you appraise it as challenging, you only get the autonomic response. Since these two responses do different things to your body, you can see that appraising things as challenging is going to lead to less changes and less harm to your body. So are all stressors created equal? Well, before I go through the parts of the body, I should tell you that I'm going to pretty much act like all stressors are equivalent and that they all lead to the same stress response. Obviously, that's an oversimplification. Two researchers conducted a meta-analysis looking at all the studies that ever stressed people out in the lab and then measured cortisol response. Now remember, cortisol is a corticosteroid and thus is one of the hormones released in response to HPA activation. And what they found is that all stressors are not created equal. The ones that have the largest effect on cortisol response are uncontrollable stressors, and stressors where the person is made to feel that they're being evaluated. So where the person feels self-esteem or social status is feeling threatened. If the stressor is both uncontrollable and threatens the person's self-esteem, that has the largest effect of all. However, this meta-analysis only looked at lab studies, which means they could only assess studies that stressed out a participant and then measured their stress response. This means that these findings could be different for chronic stressors. Before we begin with what stress does to your body, I'm going to show you a short video that highlights everything we're going to discuss. I want to highlight one important fact from this video, that being stressed doesn't automatically lead to physical damage. As we go through all the negative ways that stress affects your body, remember that there are things that you can do, such as hanging out with friends, that might reduce or prevent this damage altogether.
In a busy world with unending work and responsibilities piling up, stress can get to the best of us. But how bad is it for you, really? Can stress actually kill you? From a biological perspective, stress makes perfect sense. If you're about to get chomped on by a bear, your stress hormones better kick your butt into gear. But it turns out that your mortgage, unemployment, and looming exam all trigger the same stress response in your body. And unlike most animals, which eventually experience a major decrease in these hormones, humans can't seem to find the off switch. Even though it's not life and death, our psychological woes consistently bathe our bodies in these hormones, making our heart pound, muscles tense, and stomach turn. In Japan, they have the term karoshi, which literally translates to death from overwork. In what is now deemed an overworking epidemic, these individuals who are seemingly healthy and in their prime suddenly die. After being officially recognized and documented in Japan, these sudden heart attacks and strokes were quickly linked to stress. But how does stress cause this? Cortisol is one of the main stress hormones, which helps divert energy to where you need it and away from non-essential functions of the body. But with chronic stress exposure, problems arise. The immune system shuts down, inflammation is inhibited, white blood cells are reduced, and susceptibility to disease increases. Some evidence also suggests that prolonged stress may be involved in the development of cancer. When looking at the arteries of macaque monkeys, those under significant stress have more clogged arteries. This prevents blood from getting to the heart quickly during stress and can ultimately lead to heart attacks. The brain also takes a toll. When looking at mice exposed to stress, we see dramatically smaller brain cells with fewer branch extensions than normal mice. This is particularly prevalent in the areas associated with memory and learning, which may stir up some memories for you of those wonderful all-night study sessions. The acute stress and sleep deprivation can make it increasingly difficult to remember the things we want to. Perhaps the most telling story is in our DNA. We contain something called telomeres at the end of our chromosomes, which decrease in size with our age. Our video on aging here explains this process. Eventually, the telomeres run out, at which point the cell stops duplicating and dies. So telomeres are directly related to aging and length of life. And it turns out, stress may actually accelerate the shortening of these telomeres. But not all hope is lost for the perpetually stressed. Another hormone, oxytocin, has been shown to reduce this stress response. It helps your blood vessels relax and even regenerates the heart from stress-related damage. So how do we get more oxytocin? It's sometimes dubbed the cuddle hormone because it's released during positive social interactions and while caring for others. People who spend more time with others create a buffer or resilience to stress. So when life gets the best of you, just remember, you don't have to go it alone. Spend some time with those you love. It may just save your life.
Okay, now time to see what stress does to your body. Here's a complete list of the different things stress does to your body. And we'll go through each of these things individually throughout this video. So the first thing we're going to cover is the mobilization of energy. The primary goal of the stress response is to mobilize energy immediately so that you can use that energy to survive an emergency. Your sympathetic nervous system is in charge of sending out the signals to mobilize energy. The key feature of the stress response is the rapid mobilization of energy from storage sites throughout your body and the inhibition of further storage. Inhibition of further storage occurs because your parasympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for storing energy, is inhibited in times of stress. The energy needs to be in a readily usable form and not stored away in your fat cells. So glucose and the simplest forms of proteins and fats come pouring out of your fat cells, your liver and your muscles, and then they move wherever they're most needed, generally to the relevant muscles needed for you to get away from a threat. This process works great if you're running away from a bear because it gives you the energy to run away faster, but this isn't ideal if you're worrying about your upcoming exams. If you're worrying about something night and day, you're going to turn on the stress response too often. This leads to you constantly mobilizing energy and never storing any, which means you won't have any surplus energy. So you're going to fatigue more rapidly than you'll want. And this will also increase your risk of getting adult onset diabetes, but only if you're already predisposed to diabetes. And this occurs through a complicated chain of events in which your cells stop responding to insulin because of your constant mobilization of energy. Now, once you've mobilized all that glucose, you need to deliver it to those critical muscles as fast as you possibly can. So all your transport systems start working extra hard. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, and your breathing rate increases. They all do this in order to transport glucose and oxygen at faster rates. This aids the mobilization of energy. Again, this process is very handy in the short run if you're being chased by a bear, for example. But if you're worrying about your grades all the time, constantly having this stress response is just going to add to the wear and tear of your heart by causing it to work extra hard all the time. Constantly increasing your heart rate and blood pressure can lead to hypertension, damaged blood vessels, and strokes. The cardiovascular system is the prototypical system overworked by stress. When people make comments about stress, they often state that you need to relax or you're going to give yourself a heart attack, and so forth. So this makes intuitive sense to most people. For people who are constantly running the stress response, they end up with an accumulation of damage in their hearts and blood vessels. The more damaged your heart is, the more likely it is that a sudden acute stressor will be too much for it to handle. So these people are prone to sudden death in response to major stressors. And it's been pretty well documented that fatal heart attacks often occur during a stressor. An example comes from the former CEO of Enron. Many of you guys probably remember the whole Enron debacle. But if you haven't, for about a decade, it was the biggest deal in the corporate world, basically. Before there was a Google or Facebook, there was an Enron, and they were making a lot of money, and apparently it was just the most wonderful place in the world to work. In fact, it was named the most innovative company in the world by Fortune magazine for 6 years in a row. And then, in the fall of 2001, in what was a huge shock to the industry, it went bankrupt. And turned out that it only looked like Enron was making a lot of money and doing well, when in fact it was massively inflating how well it was doing with clever and systematic accounting fraud and corruption. Its CEO, Ken Lay, was convicted of many counts of conspiracy and fraud, and was likely to be sent off to prison for the rest of his life. But while awaiting sentencing, he died of a massive heart attack, and accounts suggest that after years of high levels of stress, he suffered a fatal heart attack after learning he'd go to prison for 25 to 40 years. And many people think that Ken Lay, Enron's founder, died as a result of extreme stress. Another interesting example, sudden cardiac arrest in response to stressors might also explain some instances of what is known as voodoo death. Voodoo death is where some shaman puts some sort of curse on a person, and convincingly soon the person drops dead. If you study all the documented cases of voodoo death, you have to rule out a bunch of them, because either the person was already on the verge of death before the shaman put the curse on him, or because the shaman secretly poisoned the person and just claimed to have killed him with a curse. However, even after ruling out all those cases, there are still cases left, and those are thought to be examples of sudden cardiac death in response to an extreme stressor. So yeah, these people seem to have literally been scared to death. Digestion is run primarily by your parasympathetic nervous system, and that system is suppressed during stress. So digestion is inhibited. This allows your body to expend energy elsewhere instead of on digestion. This response is helpful if you're running from a bear, but not so helpful if you're safe in your apartment, turning on the stress response repeatedly as you worry about your midterms or your final exams. So under stress, one symptom that people notice in themselves a lot is that their mouth goes dry. That's because with digestion turned off, you stop secreting saliva. Now I bet that I'm losing some of you here because you're thinking, yeah, right, if digestion turns off under stress, then how come whenever I'm extremely stressed, I have to rush to the bathroom? You aren't imagining that. And in fact, truly terrified people have been known to urinate or defecate in their pants. This is why convicts about to be executed are always put into diapers. The digestive system is run primarily by the parasympathetic nervous system, which shuts down, but also partly by the sympathetic nervous system, which gets activated. The parasympathetic system runs your stomach and small intestine, which do the job of grinding up your food to get the nutrients out of the food and store the nutrients away to nourish you later. This process comes to a halt with stress. The sympathetic system runs your large intestine, colon, and bladder, and since the sympathetic system is activated, these parts work harder. When the parts don't process and make use of food, these parts simply move food and waste through your system. The sympathetic system also instructs your bladder to empty, and it's easy to guess why these things adapted. They adapted to empty all the dead weight of food from your system so that you can get away from predators faster. While people who are constantly running the stress response don't generally have embarrassing accidents, they can get colitis and irritable bowel syndrome, problems where the small and large intestines get out of whack. Their coordination with each other gets messed up because one of them's constantly being turned on and the other one's constantly being turned off. These digestive problems are common. About 10 or 15% of the U.S. population suffers from some sort of irritable bowel syndrome or spastic colon in response to stress. Ulcers are another common problem from the stress response being on too long. More specifically, ulcers are caused by stress and by a specific bacteria, which was discovered by scientists back in 1982. These scientists actually won a Nobel Prize for discovering that ulcers were caused by bacteria. Only about 10% of people with this bacteria actually gets ulcers. The people who get these ulcers tend to be the people who are under chronic stress. The way this works is the bacteria starts to create little cuts in the protective lining of the stomach, but your stomach usually repairs those cuts itself as part of the normal digestion process. However, if you're constantly stopping digestion, the stomach doesn't stop to repair these little cuts. And then when digestion does start up, sometime in the future, the acid released into the stomach that's used to break down foods now eats away at the unprotected part of your stomach lining, which in turn creates ulcers. So stress isn't directly causing these ulcers per se, but instead it's impairing the body's ability to defend against ulcers that start to be formed by bacteria. Now talk about how stress influences your growth. Your parasympathetic system, which is inhibited under stress, is responsible for long-term building projects, like extending your long bones. And it's easy to see why your parasympathetic nervous system, the amount of investment you put into growth, might be shut down during times of stress. These long-term growing projects use a lot of energy. And under stress, the body has no need to plan for a future that's so uncertain. If you're not going to be alive in 10 minutes, why devote any energy to growth? Again, this response is great if you're outrunning a predator, but not so great if you're staying at home worrying about your grades. In very extreme cases, this can result in something called stress dwarfism, in which a child stops growing because they're in extremely stressful situations. Importantly, this doesn't happen in response to normal stressful situations, such as moving or having your parents get divorced or even die. These are very extreme situations. Every once in a while, a case of this is found when police break into some home after reports of something suspicious is going on there. It comes to light, and they find a child who's been locked in a dark closet for months or even years. This child's always much shorter than one would expect based on their age, and even after taking their short stature into account, they're usually underweight. Furthermore, if you check their blood, they tend to have minuscule levels of growth hormone. Luckily, if you put the child in a different environment, they tend to grow back to a pretty reasonable size within about a year or two, provided that the victim is still prepubescent. One interesting anecdote that relates here is the story of J.M. Barrie. He grew up in a wealthy British family. About when he was 6, his older brother was killed in a skating accident just 2 weeks before his 14th birthday. J.M. Barrie's mom went off into basically the classic Victorian swoon. She took to her bed and pretty much stayed there for the better part of a decade. The older brother had been the beloved favorite of the mother, and the mother really had no interest in her surviving younger son. The dad, for that matter, didn't really speak to him much either, and thus he grew up practically abandoned in his own home, and treated like he didn't even really exist. To make the whole situation worse, the only times the mother did interact with him, she obsessively told him the same thing over and over again, that her only solace comes from knowing that his brother died while he was still perfect, still a boy, and so could never be ruined by growing up and leaving his mother. Even though his family was well off, and the boy had no signs of any illness, he stopped growing, and as an adult was only 4'10". This is thought to be a case of stress dwarfism. And just in case you don't know who J.M. Barrie is, he was the author of Peter Pan, which gives us some insight into this writer's psychology and maybe his inspiration for writing this book. Now I'll move on to reproduction. Reproduction uses an enormous amount of energy, particularly for females. And the results of this energy are often not apparent for a very long time. One of the reactions to stress of the HPA axis causes a slowing of reproduction. Specifically, this is caused by the pituitary gland. Again, similar to some of the other processes we've already discussed, this decrease is adaptive. There's no need to waste energy reproducing when you may or may not survive fleeing from a charging bear. However, this isn't so helpful if, again, you're safe in your apartment worrying about your grades. Stress can lead to impotence in men because the parasympathetic system, which is turned off when stressed, must be on if a male is going to achieve an erection. Also, stress can decrease levels of testosterone and estrogen, so stress can lead to a loss in interest in sex for both men and women. Furthermore, for women, too much stress can lead to delayed or complete cessation of ovulation and increased likelihood of miscarriages. This becomes a big problem for some couples who are undergoing infertility treatments. The stress of the treatments themselves and the inability to get pregnant can decrease the effectiveness of these infertility treatments. Now we'll talk about how stress influences pain. We'll dedicate an entire video to pain later on in the semester, but for now, let's just say that pain and stress are strongly intertwined, and their relationship is bidirectional. Pain influences stress, and stress influences pain. Generally speaking, they make each other worse. But if stress is sufficiently extreme, sometimes stress can block pain perception. This, again, is due to HPA axis activation. Remember, activation of the HPA axis leads to the release of corticosteroids. If you're running from a polar bear and you're injured, now would not be a good time to go into shock from extreme pain. There are numerous anecdotes of soldiers in battle during wars not noticing their injuries until a comrade brings those injuries to their attention after the heat of battle is over. The downside of this blunting of pain is that you can actually aggravate your injuries. This is because pain functions as a warning sign. It tells you to back off on the injured part of your body. So acute stress can trigger beta endorphins. That's a chemical messenger that blocks pain perception, but then you end up injuring yourself even further because you don't realize just how badly you've injured your body. Not until you take some time to notice the injury does the pain leap out at you. Unfortunately, chronic stress is a different story. Chronic stress can actually lead you to deplete your stores of beta endorphins, so these chemicals that help blunt your pain. And in fact, you can actually run out of them under chronic stress. And therefore, your body is no longer able to control its pain very well. Now we'll talk about how stress influences aging. We all know that stress seems to age people. Just look at how much George Bush aged between 2000 and 2004, and 2004 and 2008. Similarly, we can see how Barack Obama aged in similar 4-year increments. Obviously, being the President of the United States is a very stressful job, and this stress results in premature aging. Elisa Epel studied women who had been experiencing extreme stress for years. These women were taking care of children suffering from chronic illnesses such as autism. And she compared them to similar women who had healthy children. Specifically, Epel examined structures inside cells called telomeres. So what the hell is a telomere? So if you look at the end of your shoelaces, you'll see little things holding your shoelaces together. These little things are called aglets. Telomeres are basically just aglets for your chromosomes. They're the caps at the ends of your chromosomes, which themselves are molecules that carry your genes. Every time a cell divides, the telomeres get shorter, and this is part of the natural aging process. Eventually, the telomeres get so short that they can no longer divide, and then they die. So telomeres are a nice marker of aging. As more and more cells reach the end of their telomeres and die, the effects of aging become apparent. So, for example, your muscles weaken, your skin wrinkles, your eyesight and hearing fade, your organs begin to fail, and your cognitive abilities begin to diminish. So Epel and colleagues found that chronic stress appears to accelerate this aging process. The longer a woman had been caring for a sick child, the shorter her telomeres. And that's what this graph is showing you here. The x-axis is the number of years that somebody spent as a caregiver, taking care of a sick child, and the y-axis is telomere length, and we see this pretty pronounced negative correlation. The more time these women spent caring for a sick child, the shorter their telomere lengths. And this correlation of 0.45 is actually quite a strong correlation. Furthermore, they found that what seemed to matter the most was perceived stress rather than actual levels of stress. Compared with women with the lowest levels of perceived stress, women with the highest levels of perceived stress had telomere lengths equivalent to somebody 10 years older. That's basically what this graph is showing. The x-axis is showing you the participant scores on the perceived stress scale, and the y-axis, again, is showing telomere length. The red dots are the caregivers, and the blue diamonds are the control subjects, so people who weren't caring for sick children. As perceived stress increases, telomere length decreases for both caregivers and the control group. Thus, it doesn't matter, even though these caregivers were obviously under more stress than the controls, this correlation held true for both control and caregivers. These negative correlations are essentially the same, indicating that what matters is perceived stress. Even though clearly the caregivers were under more stress, and you see here, there's all kinds of stress, there's all kinds of red dots on this high end of the scale, and the vast majority of blue dots are on the low end of the scale. However, the correlation holds up regardless of how stressful somebody's life really is. The correlation holds up at the low end of the stress scale, and it holds up on the high end. So this study provided the first evidence that stress leads to changes on a cellular level that could lead to premature aging. If you look this study up now, it has something like 1,000 citations, and in part it's because this study is such a powerful demonstration that there is no such thing as a separation between the mind and the body. Instead, the cells in our body are responsive to our psychological environment. Going back to Hans Selye, an interesting quote by our old friend Hans, he said that every stress leaves an indelible scar, and the organism pays for its survival after a stressful situation by becoming a little older. One of the things that I've mentioned is that during the acute stress response, a bunch of oxygen and glucose rush to your brain. Well, if that's the case, it seems like this process should enhance our cognitive abilities. And it's true, in the short run, an acute stressor will help your memory. Studies show that people remember the parts of a story they hear right after a stressor better than the parts of a story they hear without a stressor around. And this is quite adaptive. It's really helpful if you have to figure out how to survive in the next emergency situation. But if you're dealing with a chronic stressor, then your memory suffers. Even after a few hours of sustained stress, your transport systems begin delivering less instead of more oxygen and glucose to the brain. Plus, repeatedly flooding your brain with cortisol can cause the hippocampus to atrophy. And the hippocampus is a part of the brain that's critical for learning and memory. We know that cortisol has this effect on the hippocampus because there's a disease called Cushing's syndrome in which people secrete tons of cortisol and they get something called Cushing's dementia, which leads to atrophy of the hippocampus. Luckily, these people can be treated and cured. Their hippocampus can be returned to normal volume. So you might be asking yourself, so flooding your brain with cortisol causes the hippocampus to atrophy. Okay, but does that mean that stress can cause your hippocampus to atrophy? That is, does stress really lead to that much cortisol increase that it can actually influence your hippocampus? Well, we have some evidence of this. In one study of Vietnam vets who were in combat for long periods of time, researchers did brain scans, specifically MRIs, of the vets, and were able to measure the volume of the hippocampus. They found that the longer the vets were in combat, the smaller the volume of the vet's hippocampus. And that's what this graph is showing. The x-axis is combat exposure, and the y-axis is the size of hippocampus. And again, huge correlation here, negative 0.72. It's a very strong relationship. So as combat time increases, hippocampus size decreases. Thus, the longer you are in combat, the more cortisol was released into your brain, and over time that led to the atrophy of this important brain structure. Another study looked at more mundane circumstances. These researchers looked at flight attendants who worked either intercontinental flights, or, both groups of participants worked in intercontinental flights. And these are the super long overnight flights. One group of these flight attendants were given 15 days to recover from each of these intercontinental flights. So they worked for an airline that gave them more than 2 weeks to recover from these long flights. But the other group worked for an airline that only gave them 5 days to recover from these intercontinental flights. So very short recovery crews. The results showed that flight attendants given less recovery time, so 5 days, had smaller hippocampus volumes and more cognitive deficits compared to flight attendants who were given 15 days to recover from their intercontinental flights. On this graph, the black dots are the crew members who got 15 days to recover from their intercontinental flights, whereas the white dots were the crew who were only given 5 days to recover from their intercontinental flights. The x-axis is a measure of cortisol, which works as a measure of stress, and the y-axis is the measure of their hippocampus volumes. And this graph shows that crew members who got less recovery time had more stress and smaller hippocampus volumes. So we're just looking at these white dots here, these people who got shorter recovery times, and we see that this is really quite a steep decline. So the amount of stress experienced with these short recovery times had an effect on hippocampus volume. The longer recovery flight crews showed no correlation at all between their cortisol levels and hippocampus volume. And that's what this black line is showing. It's pretty much straight. Their cortisol levels had no impact on their hippocampus volume. It was only for these flight attendants with short recovery times who showed this relationship. However, there's a caveat to this research. For years, much of this research, as was mentioned in the last video, was conducted on males, with a few exceptions, such as those looking at female flight attendants. However, recent researchers have discovered that there may be gender differences with regard to the effect that chronic stress has on memory. Larry Cahill is one researcher who's conducted new studies determining the effects of gender and sex hormones on stress and memory. And he suggests that women, especially women who have higher levels of estrogen, don't suffer from memory impairments with chronic stress. However, he doesn't imply that they have no impairments. Remember, women under chronic stress show signs of increased aging. Research in this area is still unfolding. I just want you to be aware that these gender differences may exist. Now let's talk briefly about how stress impacts the immune system. The short, oversimplified story is that under stress, your immune system is suppressed. Again, this is adaptive. There's no need to expend energy fighting off diseases that might kill you tomorrow or 10 years from now if you may not live another 10 minutes. With your immune response suppressed, however, your body may be unable to resist many serious diseases. And there is evidence that stress is linked to infections and that it can make wounds heal slower than normal. I'm going to tell you a bit about that now, but we'll talk about this in more detail in the next video. In one study, researchers asked subjects to check into a specially reserved hotel for a little more than a week. Essentially, they were quarantined this whole time. They weren't allowed to leave this hotel. For the first 2 days of the study, the participants just had their baseline measures taken. The subjects filled out numerous questionnaires about their stress levels. Stress is measured in all kinds of ways in these studies, but in this study, they not only measured what stressful events subjects experienced, but they also measured subjects' appraisals of how stressful these events were. Then on day 3, the subjects were randomly assigned to be exposed to a cold virus or a placebo. And then for the next week, researchers who were blind to the aim of the study and the subjects' conditions examined the subjects every day to record their cold symptoms. They also collected nasal washings to look for signs of the virus itself. In other words, they collected these people's snot, which is gross. So they found that the rate of colds increased linearly with increases in stress. They also found that the longer the stressful event lasted, the more likely the person was to develop a cold. In this graph, the x-axis is how long a chronic stressor lasted, and the y-axis is the relative risk of getting a cold. The relative risk just meaning how much more likely someone is in the experimental group to get a cold than somebody in the control group. And we can see that the longer a stressor lasted, if people happened to be experiencing a stressor, the longer that they were experiencing this stressor when this study occurred, the more likely they were to experience cold symptoms. This relative risk of 1 just means that if you weren't experiencing any stressor when the study started, people in the experimental group who were exposed to the cold virus were no more likely to exhibit symptoms of the cold virus than people who were given a placebo. Over here, at 24 months, people who had been experiencing a chronic stressor for 24 months at the time of the study were 4 more times likely to exhibit cold symptoms than participants who were given the placebo. There are 2 key things you should really appreciate from this video's discussion. First, it should be clear that if you're faced with a physical stressor, such as being chased by a mugger or a predator, and you can't turn on the stress response, you're going to be in big trouble. You're going to be less able to avoid that stressor. However, if you repeatedly turn on the stress response or you can't turn it off after a stressful event ends, the stress response can eventually become damaging or even become as damaging or even more damaging than the stressors themselves. When we think of stress-related disease, we generally think of disorders that result from an accumulation of damage resulting from excessively running the stress response. And as you saw in this video, that includes a lot of different diseases affecting many different systems of the body. However, there's one notable exception: cancer, which is what one of your readings for this video was about. I'll say more about this at another time, but if you're looking for links between stress and incidence, progression, or likelihood of relapse of cancer, you're not going to find them. I know the video I showed you at the beginning of this video, so I guess the meta video, I suppose, mentioned a potential link between cancer and stress. However, there's no solid evidence of this stress-cancer link.